Before the first sound echoed across creation, before light touched the surface of the deep, there was something already unfolding, something unspoken, hidden behind the veil of eternity. Most have never heard of it, and many who sense it cannot quite name it. It is not a story confined to earth, to history, or to human conflict. It is a story that began far above, in a realm most only imagine in whispers or in dreams, a war beyond the stars. Heaven. The very word evokes images of peace, of serenity, of choirs and golden streets. It is imagined as a realm untouched by decay or dispute, a place where all is perfect and every being is in harmony. But what if that vision, though beautiful, is not the full truth? What if beneath the stillness there was once thunder? What if the place we call heaven bore the scars of battle long before earth even existed? This war is not a fable. It is not allegory, not myth. It is real. It was fought in places no eye has seen, between beings that burn with power and purpose. And unlike human wars, which pass with time, this one never truly ended. Its effects ripple into this world and into our very lives. Every hardship, every temptation, every unseen struggle carries echoes of that ancient conflict. There is a reason the soul longs for peace yet finds so little. There is a reason some battles feel far too large for one person to bear. It is because these struggles are not born of random circumstance, but of something far more profound. They trace back to a choice made outside of time, to a revolt that split the heavens and redrew the landscape of existence itself. The Church, in its long history, has often spoken of love, grace, and redemption, and rightly so. But rarely does it speak of the war. Rarely does it explain why humanity finds itself caught between forces it cannot see. There are verses that hint at it, fragments in sacred texts, symbols wrapped in mystery, but few dare to trace them, to pull the thread all the way back to the beginning. Yet the beginning is where the truth lies, a truth too dangerous to ignore, too explosive to dismiss. This war, hidden behind theology and ritual, is the very source of our fractured reality. It is not about armies clashing with swords in a distant realm. It is about allegiance, about identity, about a breach in the order of heaven itself. There was a moment, unseen by time, when harmony was broken, a single act, a spark of defiance, and suddenly eternity was no longer still. The perfect order of the spiritual realm began to crack. What could have caused such a thing? What power could defy the very fabric of divine structure? And why was it allowed to happen? The answer begins not on earth, but in the courts of heaven, where beings of immense glory stood in ranks, where thrones and dominions ruled with divine purpose. There something changed, not among the weak, but among the mighty. The story does not begin with humanity's fall, but with a higher fall, a rebellion so profound that it changed the destiny of the entire cosmos. Some have sensed this conflict in the quietest moments, a pressure they cannot name, a resistance they cannot trace. They may not see the battle, but they feel its weight. In the fear that strikes without warning, in the doubt that creeps in during prayer, in the questions no one seems to answer. These are not isolated experiences. They are fragments of a war most never knew existed. The psalmist once wrote, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain?" Psalm 2, verse 1. Rage does not begin with man. It is inherited. It is passed down through spiritual lineage, through invisible corridors that connect realms. Earth is not the origin, it is the reflection. To understand the world as it is, one must look past the surface. To understand heaven, one must accept that even the highest places were once shaken. The story is not simple, nor is it safe, but it is necessary. For only when the war is revealed can the strategy of the enemy be understood, and only then can the victory be claimed with full awareness of what it cost. There is a truth buried beneath centuries of doctrine and silence. A truth that tells us we are not passive inhabitants of a peaceful universe, but participants in a grand cosmic tension. This war has not ended. Its battlefield is all around us, and to ignore it is to walk blindfolded into enemy territory. The hidden war is not science fiction. It is the architecture of reality. It predates the stars, outlasts empires, and reaches into every corner of the human heart. This war is not just ancient, it is present, not just cosmic, it is personal. What follows is not speculation, it is revelation. Not all truths are soft. Some burn, some shatter illusions, but they are still truth, and truth, even when painful, sets us free. Among the vast host of heavenly beings, there was one whose presence stood above the rest. Not in defiance, but in brilliance. Not in challenge, but in beauty and function. This being was known as Lucifer, the light-bearer, created with extraordinary excellence, wisdom, and radiance. According to Ezekiel 28 verse 12, he was the seal of perfection, full of wisdom, and perfect in beauty, adorned with precious stones and positioned as a covering cherub in the very courts of the divine. He was not only among the highest ranking of all created beings, but also entrusted with a nearness to God that few others could comprehend. Heaven's structure was not chaotic or flat. It was ordered, with ranks and responsibilities assigned to each being according to divine wisdom. Within this order, Lucifer held an elevated position of governance and glory. His role was sacred, his proximity to God's throne symbolic of trust and unparalleled honor. Music flowed through his very being as though worship itself was woven into his form. He didn't just offer praise, he embodied it. And yet, in the midst of this radiant purpose, a fracture began to form. What unfolded within Lucifer cannot be dismissed as mere pride in the human sense. This was something deeper, more deliberate, and far more dangerous. Pride was the seed, but treason was the fruit. Somewhere within the corridors of his once loyal heart, admiration for his own magnificence began to outweigh his reverence for the one who had crafted it. Isaiah 14 verses 13 to 14 records his inner declaration, "I will ascend to the heavens, I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will make myself like the Most High." These were not careless or impulsive thoughts. They were calculated, strategic, utterly treacherous. The horror of Lucifer's fall does not stem merely from the scale of his pride, but from the context in which it occurred. This was not a fallen man rebelling against the Creator. This was a being who had seen glory with unveiled eyes, who had walked amid the stones of fire, who had been trusted with divine proximity, and who, in full awareness of truth, chose to distort it. Rebellion, in the very place where rebellion should have been inconceivable, ignited a fire that would burn through creation itself. Lucifer's aim was not simply to disobey. His ambition extended far beyond opposition. He desired elevation above all others. He wanted to dethrone God. It was a desire to shift the center of all worship, honor, and power to himself. He did not wish to coexist with the divine order. He sought to replace it. His was not a rebellion of dissatisfaction, but of aspiration to ultimate rule. This was not confusion. It was revolution. The staggering truth this reveals is that even in heaven, betrayal was possible. The very sanctuary of holiness, purity, and celestial order contained within it the capacity for corruption, not because God created evil, but because he created beings with the capacity for choice. Lucifer was not a robot. He was not forced into obedience. His worship, his service, his splendor, it all stemmed from volition. And where there is freedom, there is also the potential for rebellion. Lucifer began to spread his twisted ideology, not through open warfare, not at first, but through subtle influence. Persuasion became his weapon, doubt his strategy. Among the angelic host, he began to sow the same lie he had believed, that the created could ascend above their station, that equality with God was not only desirable, but attainable. Through this campaign of deception, a portion of heaven's own angels were led astray, not because they were ignorant, but because they were seduced by a counterfeit vision of power. This origin of evil is chilling, not only because of its spiritual consequences, but because of what it suggests about vigilance. If the highest being in heaven could fall, then no one is immune to the gravity of self-exaltation. If betrayal could fester in the holy courts, how much more aware must humanity be as it walks a world so far removed from that original glory? Lucifer's descent reminds us that no place is so sacred that it is safe from pride, and no being so exalted that it cannot choose rebellion. What makes his fall irreversible is the clarity with which he acted. He did not stumble into sin. He chose it with understanding. He exchanged intimacy with God for a crown forged by ego. He traded truth for a lie he crafted himself, and he led others into that same delusion, fracturing heaven's harmony and birthing a schism that would spill into every layer of creation. The light-bearer became the adversary. His identity, once pure and sacred, was transformed by his treachery. He was no longer a reflection of divine glory, but a perversion of it. He lost his place, but not his memory. He lost his role, but not his cunning. And though cast out, he carried his rebellion with him like a torch, seeking to ignite it wherever willing hearts could be found. This chapter in the unseen history of creation is more than a tale of angelic failure. It is the beginning of a spiritual war that continues to touch every human life. It is the reason Earth became contested ground, the reason humanity became a target. Lucifer's desire to ascend didn't end in heaven. It descended with him. He was determined to rise, even if it meant dragging creation into darkness to build his throne atop its ruins. The moment Lucifer's treason moved from concealed ambition to active rebellion, heaven itself became a battlefield. What had begun in the shadows of one being's pride erupted into open conflict. No longer was it a matter of whispers or seduction. This was war, and not a metaphorical struggle of ideologies, but an actual division within the ranks of the heavenly host. A confrontation that pierced the peace of eternity. Revelation 12 verse 7 states it plainly. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. This was not the symbolic language of dreams. It was the Spirit unveiling to John what had occurred in the eternal realm. An event far more real than any earthly war, and infinitely more consequential. Michael, the archangel, was not just a leader among angels. He was heaven's appointed warrior, the commander of divine armies. His name means, "Who is like God?" And in the context of this cosmic conflict, that question was not rhetorical. It was a challenge against the very claim Lucifer had made. Lucifer sought to become like the Most High. Michael stood in defense of the truth that no one could. In this celestial confrontation, heaven was no longer unified. A third of the angelic host, deceived by Lucifer's vision, had pledged allegiance to him. Revelation 12 verse 4 says the dragon's tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth, a poetic yet profound image of how many had fallen with him. These were not random defectors. They were once beings of light, of service, of purpose. Now they stood in defiance of their Creator, not because they were forced, but because they chose to follow a different throne. The question arises, how do spiritual beings, beings without flesh or mortality, engage in war? What does conflict look like in a realm where material weapons do not exist? The answer lies in understanding the nature of heavenly warfare. This was not a battle of swords and shields in the earthly sense. The weapons were truth and deception, obedience and defiance, authority and rebellion. The power wielded was not through crafted metal, but through the very essence of spiritual identity and alignment. Each angel fought with the totality of their allegiance, either to the throne of God or to the ambition of Lucifer. The loyal angels, led by Michael, were not operating out of mere loyalty to position, but out of an unshakable commitment to the holiness of God's order. They understood that the beauty of heaven was not just in its splendor, but in its harmony, a harmony that rebellion threatened to unravel. They stood not because they had no choice, but because they recognized that truth was worth defending even in a realm of eternal light. And the rebel angels, corrupted by their leader's vision of self-exaltation, stood firm not out of fear, but out of conviction in a lie. They believed in a new hierarchy, one in which they could rise above the constraints of divine purpose and become rulers of their own destiny. In that sense, the war in heaven was a war of government, a contest between divine order and a counterfeit regime. This war was swift, but it was not without intensity. Though the outcome was never in doubt, God's authority is absolute. The act of rebellion still required judgment, and judgment demanded confrontation. Heaven, though perfect, was not exempt from the consequences of choice. Every being had to decide. The moment demanded it. There was no neutral ground, no space for silence. Allegiance had to be declared, and it had to be proven. Michael and the loyal host prevailed, not because they outnumbered the rebels, but because they fought in alignment with the will and power of God. Their victory was not due to skill, but to position, spiritually rooted in obedience. Revelation 12 verse 8 declares that the dragon and his angels were not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. They were expelled, not relocated, but forcefully removed. The very atmosphere of heaven rejected them. Their presence, once tolerated in silence, became a violation that had to be erased. The implications of this war are profound. It shattered the illusion that evil only dwells below. It revealed that choice, real, consequential choice, exists even in the most sacred of places. Heaven did not fall apart, but it was pierced. It was not overthrown, but it was challenged. And in that challenge, every angel had to choose, every throne had to be defended. That moment reveals a truth far too often overlooked. Neutrality in a spiritual war is not safety, it is surrender. The angels who remained silent would have been swept away. Those who waited to see which side would win had already chosen the wrong side. Allegiance mattered, and it was revealed in action. The outcome established a precedent. Rebellion, no matter how eloquent or radiant, has no future in the presence of God. The authority of heaven cannot be shared with pride. The glory of the Most High cannot coexist with insurrection. And yet, the defeated were not destroyed, not then. Instead, they were cast out. Their presence no longer permitted in heaven. They were hurled into a new realm, a new battlefield. Their war would continue not because heaven had failed, but because earth had become their next target. When the great rebellion was crushed and the traitorous angels were cast from heaven, they did not vanish into some distant corner of the cosmos, nor were they contained in an unreachable void. They were hurled into a place that had already been crafted by divine hands, a place full of life, beauty, and potential. They were cast to earth, not as visitors, not as prisoners, but as exiles with an unfinished mission. Earth, by divine design, became the new theater of war, not because it was cursed, but because it had become the most strategic location in the entire created order. This was not a random consequence. It was a calculated maneuver allowed within God's sovereign framework. The war had not ended with Lucifer's fall. It had only shifted in focus, and in this new phase, humanity would become the center of attention. What began as a cosmic rebellion among celestial beings now descended into the realm of flesh and soil, where a different kind of creation had begun to flourish. In the beginning, Earth was not designed for conflict. It was not built as a battlefield, but as a garden. a sanctuary of communion between the Creator and his image bearers. The Garden of Eden was the first sanctuary, not simply because it was beautiful, but because it hosted presence. It was a realm where heaven touched earth, where God walked with man. And it was here, in this sacred space, that the enemy made his move. Satan's appearance in Eden was not an impulsive act. It was a carefully orchestrated invasion. He had lost access to heaven, but he had not lost his will to dominate. And he understood something critical. Earth had been entrusted to humanity. Dominion had been given not to angels, but to mankind. Genesis 1 verse 28 makes it clear, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion." This commission wasn't symbolic. It was spiritual authority extended to Earth's stewards. To sabotage Earth, Satan had to corrupt its rulers. To regain influence, he had to deceive the ones who bore the image of the one he hated. His entrance into the garden was not as a monster or a conqueror, but as a whisper, a question, a suggestion wrapped in deceit. In Genesis 3 verse 1, he asks the woman, "Did God really say, 'You must not eat from any tree in the garden'?" That question was more than temptation. It was the echo of the very rebellion that had begun in heaven. It cast doubt on the nature of God, implied limitation, and offered elevation. It mirrored the lie that Lucifer once believed, that one could rise above divine boundaries and seize authority for oneself. The Garden of Eden, in this context, was not merely a paradise lost, it was a strategic target. It was the new spiritual outpost of the kingdom of God on earth. Satan did not appear there to explore. He came to disrupt, to divide, and to destroy. And when Adam and Eve partook of the forbidden tree, they did more than disobey. They surrendered authority. The dominion they had been given was fractured, not because they lost God's favor entirely, but because they had aligned with the very force that had rebelled in heaven. From that moment, the war entered human history. Satan had successfully transferred the battlefield from celestial realms into human reality. Humanity, made in God's image, now carried the consequences of spiritual betrayal. And earth, once purely a sanctuary, became contested ground. The curse that followed was not simply punishment, it was the spiritual fallout of war. Thorns, pain, sweat, death, these were not arbitrary. They were signs that the environment itself had shifted. The earth had become a reflection of a larger conflict, and everything on it now bore the marks of invasion. But Satan's motivation went beyond spite. Humanity reminded him of what he lost. Each human life carried a reflection of the image he had once stood near in glory. Each soul carried the breath of the Creator, a spark of divine purpose that he could never reclaim. The hatred was not abstract, it was deeply personal. Every effort to deceive, to pervert, to destroy was fueled by vengeance against what he could no longer access. Earth became more than territory. It became a canvas upon which he would attempt to erase the image of God. The battlefield expanded rapidly. Cain killed Abel, not simply out of jealousy, but as the first human to act under corrupted influence. Idolatry arose. Cities were built on pride. Nations were founded on blood. From Babel to Babylon, the structures of human society began to mirror the spiritual rebellion that had seeded them. But even as earth fell deeper into conflict, it was not abandoned. God did not retreat. He began to act through covenants, through promises, through prophetic voices. He called out individuals like Noah, Abraham, and Moses, not merely to bless them, but to preserve a line, to protect a legacy, to prepare for a greater confrontation that was still to come. The enemy's strategy, however, evolved. It was no longer enough to deceive individuals. Now entire regions had to be claimed, cultures had to be shaped, thrones erected, altars defiled. The war on earth became generational, ideological, systemic. And yet, beneath the surface of every struggle, behind the veil of every empire and religion and war, the true battle continued, Satan seeking to maintain control, and heaven preparing to reclaim it. Earth was never random. It was chosen, not for destruction but for redemption, and because it was chosen, it became targeted. The presence of humanity on this planet is not meaningless, it is central. The war in heaven found its new frontier in the soil of earth, and every soul became a stake in the conflict. In the aftermath of humanity's fall, when the dust of Eden still echoed with the weight of consequence, a declaration was spoken, not just as a sentence of judgment, but as a prophetic unveiling. Genesis 3 verse 15 records it. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." This was not a casual remark. It was a divine proclamation of war. A spiritual battle line was drawn, and at its center stood the mystery of two seeds, one from the woman destined to crush the serpent's head, and one from the serpent determined to oppose and destroy. This singular verse ignited an ancient conflict that would shape the entire trajectory of human history. Satan understood immediately what this meant. The victory he had claimed by deceiving Eve was temporary. The Creator had already set into motion a plan that would come through the very beings he had corrupted. The seed of the woman, humanity, would one day produce a Redeemer who would not just restore what was lost, but execute final judgment against the adversary himself. From that moment, the strategy of the enemy shifted. This was no longer about general corruption or ideological deception. Now it became targeted, tactical, genetic. The goal was to prevent the prophecy from ever being fulfilled. If the seed could be defiled, if the human bloodline could be altered beyond recognition, then the promised Messiah could never come. The war, still spiritual at its core, now took on biological dimensions. This was a seed war. The first open expression of this strategy is found in Genesis 6, where a strange and deeply unsettling account is recorded. The text tells us that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. This statement, brief yet loaded, reveals one of the most radical intrusions in biblical history. The sons of God, understood to be a specific group of divine beings, watchers, descended from their appointed stations and entered into forbidden unions with human women. From these unnatural pairings came the Nephilim. These were not ordinary giants. The term Nephilim carries connotations of fallen ones, of hybrids born from celestial rebellion and earthly flesh. They were powerful, violent, and utterly corrupted in nature. Their presence on earth was not incidental. It was strategic. The offspring of these unions polluted the human genome, introducing an unholy mixture that threatened to wipe out the pure lineage necessary for the Redeemer's arrival. Genesis 6 verse 4 calls them the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Cultures around the world preserve fragmented memories of these beings, giants, demigods, hybrid kings who ruled with cruelty and might. Their fame did not stem from righteousness. It came from domination. They were a physical manifestation of a spiritual war being waged in the realm of blood. The result of this invasion was catastrophic. Humanity, already fallen, was now facing extinction not just morally, but biologically. The image of God, encoded into human DNA, was under siege. Satan's plan was brilliant in its cruelty. If every human line could be corrupted, then the prophesied seed would never emerge. The bloodline would be broken before it could bear the Christ. This context gives new depth to the story of Noah. The flood was not an arbitrary punishment for widespread sin. It was a divine countermeasure. Genesis 6 verse 9 notes that Noah was perfect in his generations, a phrase that scholars recognize as indicating genetic purity. He and his family had not been defiled by the corruption that had spread through intermingling with the fallen. The flood, then, was not merely judgment, it was preservation, a cleansing not just of wickedness, but of contaminated bloodlines. It was a global reset to ensure the seed could still come. Yet even after the flood, the seed war did not end. Genesis 6 verse 4 adds that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. Somehow, whether by another incursion or through remnants that survived in some form, the enemy reintroduced this genetic warfare. We find their presence again in the post-flood world, in the reports of Israelite spies in Numbers 13 verse 33, who encountered the descendants of Anak and said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The Canaanite tribes that God commanded Israel to utterly destroy were not ordinary nations. Many of them bore the marks of Nephilim heritage, unnaturally large, aggressive, and steeped in blood rituals. This was not genocide, it was targeted spiritual warfare. The seed war continued through every era, and every time Israel advanced, the enemy responded with resistance rooted in corrupted bloodlines and pagan power. This also explains the intense spiritual atmosphere surrounding the genealogies of the Bible. What might seem like long lists of names are, in truth, records of preservation. They trace the unbroken line from Adam to Abraham, from David to Christ. The enemy understood this lineage far better than many believers do today. Every attempt to destroy Israel, every massacre of infants, every threat of extinction against the Jewish people throughout history, each one was an extension of this ancient war. When Pharaoh ordered the death of Hebrew baby boys in Egypt, it was not simply population control. It was demonic influence seeking to wipe out the line. When Herod commanded the slaughter in Bethlehem after hearing of Jesus' birth, it was not politics, it was prophecy under attack. Revelation 12 paints this image vividly, showing the dragon waiting before the woman to devour her child as soon as he was born. The Messiah was the target from the very beginning, and yet despite centuries of infiltration, war, and genocide, the seed survived. The promise remained intact. The Messiah came, not through a corrupted line, but through a virgin, overshadowed by the Holy Spirit, born in defiance of every effort made to prevent his arrival. The war over the seed was not just spiritual or genetic, it was also prophetic. The enemy understood that prophecy is not merely prediction, it is a declaration of what heaven intends to bring to pass. To resist prophecy is to wage war against the will of God. And Satan has done so with relentless focus, not only in ancient times, but even now. The war continues in modern forms through ideology, technology, and biology. The human body and the sanctity of life remain battlegrounds. The image of God is still under attack. The lines between human and machine, male and female, truth and delusion are being blurred again. As the war between heaven and rebellion spilled into the physical world, a new chapter of interference began, one that blurred the lines between realms in a way never sanctioned by divine order. It was not just the corruption of human bloodlines that became a threat to God's redemptive plan. Equally dangerous was the corruption of human knowledge, the unauthorized unveiling of secrets that were never meant to belong to man. At the heart of this disruption stood a group known as the Watchers. These beings, referenced briefly in Genesis 6 and expanded upon in the Book of Enoch and other ancient texts, were not imaginary or poetic metaphors. They were real, divine sentinels, a class of angels appointed to observe and oversee aspects of human development. They were never meant to interfere directly. Their role was that of watchers, not participants. But as the world grew in population and humanity increased in influence, something shifted within them. Admiration turned to desire, duty gave way to rebellion. Led by a chief named Semjaza, 200 of these celestial beings descended upon Mount Hermon and made a solemn pact. They agreed together to defy their divine mandate and take human women as wives. But this act of physical union, however vile, was only the first step. The deeper sin was in what they brought with them, knowledge not meant for the human race. Knowledge that would alter the trajectory of civilization and accelerate the corruption of Earth. The Book of Enoch gives detail to what was taught. Azazel, one of the leading watchers, taught men to craft swords, knives, and shields, to make war instead of peace. He introduced the use of metals and the forging of tools that would give one man power over another. But it did not stop with weapons. The Watchers taught enchantments, the manipulation of nature through incantations and symbols. They taught astrology, divination, and the interpretation of omens. They brought knowledge of root cutting, the use of herbs to heal or to poison, and the art of cosmetics, used not merely for adornment but for seduction, control, and deception. This was not advancement, it was contamination. The knowledge was not just forbidden because it was dangerous, but because it was delivered in rebellion. It was separated from wisdom, divorced from holiness, given not to honor the Creator, but to elevate man and empower sin. With these teachings, humanity became ensnared in tools that mimicked divine power, but were used in perverse and self-serving ways. What should have remained hidden behind spiritual boundaries became widespread, unleashing chaos and oppression. The influence of the Watchers was swift and devastating. Societies began to evolve not around the worship of God, but around the manipulation of creation. Cultures emerged with strange rituals, dark ceremonies, and sacred sites built on blood and domination. The giants born of the Watchers, the Nephilim, became tyrants, revered not for wisdom, but for sheer might. And those who taught forbidden arts became viewed as gods, sages, and prophets in civilizations long separated from their original innocence. It's critical to understand that these acts were not mere disobedience, they were insurgency. The Watchers were not confused about their purpose. They were heavenly beings, created with knowledge of the divine. Their rebellion was calculated. Their dissemination of forbidden knowledge was coordinated. They were not myth-makers. They were combatants in a war against heaven's design, and they chose to arm humanity with tools of spiritual destruction. God's response was not delayed. According to Enoch's writings, the cry of the earth rose to heaven, the groaning of nature, the blood of the innocent, the widespread lawlessness. Judgment was swift. The archangels, Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel, were dispatched with specific instructions. The Nephilim were to be destroyed. The Watchers were to be bound. One by one, these insurgent angels were seized and cast into a place of darkness, an abyss known as Tartarus in later texts. Jude verse 6 confirms this fate, stating, "And the angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day." Their sin was too grave to be ignored, too damaging to be left unchecked. They were locked away, but their influence, tragically, remained. The knowledge they introduced did not vanish with them. It continued, preserved in oral tradition, later encoded into occult systems, passed down through civilizations that had no idea where it came from, or worse, worshipped its origin. From the mysteries of ancient Babylon to the rites of Egypt, from the blood-soaked temples of Mesoamerica to the secret schools of alchemy and sorcery in medieval times, the shadow of the Watchers never fully disappeared. In today's world, this influence manifests not only through explicit occultism, but in subtle forms, philosophies that exalt man above God, technologies that mimic creation without reverence, spiritual practices divorced from holiness, and systems of power that prey on the weak under the guise of enlightenment or liberation. The same old whispers, rebranded for modern ears. The Watchers' rebellion opened doors that humanity was never equipped to walk through. Portals into realms of thought and spirit that require divine covering, not curiosity. Their teachings dismantled boundaries between heaven and earth, truth and deception, order and chaos. And those doors, once opened, remain a threat until they are shut by authority greater than what opened them. This is why God judged the Watchers so harshly, not only because they disobeyed, but because their disobedience wounded the world. They betrayed their place, violated the sacred trust, and turned their gaze downward in pursuit of power. They infected humanity with knowledge that bore the appearance of wisdom, but carried the weight of death. Long after the visible conflicts of ancient days faded into history books and ruins, an invisible war continued to shape the world in profound ways. Though swords rusted and empires fell, the real powers that orchestrated those battles remained in place, entrenched, veiled, and still operating. When Paul wrote in Ephesians 6 verse 12 that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places, he was peeling back the curtain on a spiritual infrastructure that governs reality. He was revealing that the true war, the one that began in heaven and spilled onto earth, never ended. It merely changed dimensions. Paul's words were not metaphorical. He was describing a structured hierarchy in the unseen realm. These were not vague ideas or cultural superstitions. They were, and still are, real spiritual entities assigned to rule over specific domains, cities, nations, institutions, ideologies. They are the invisible hands that influence the visible systems. Thrones are not just seats of earthly power. They are spiritual platforms. Principalities are not merely large regions of control. They are territories governed by ancient spirits whose roots go back to the earliest chapters of rebellion. After the fall of man and the corruption of creation, the earth did not simply descend into chaos. It was reorganized. The divine order had been disrupted, and what remained was a world layered with spiritual zones, places of influence and authority occupied by forces that were no longer aligned with the Creator. These principalities set up dominion in the atmosphere around humanity. They were not omnipresent or all-powerful, but they were deeply embedded into the systems people interact with every day. Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, when rendered from its older manuscripts, offers a profound revelation. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. This suggests that long ago, during the division of humanity, God assigned spiritual beings over the nations. But many of these beings, having rebelled, twisted their oversight into tyranny. What was meant to be guidance became manipulation. What was designed as stewardship turned into subjugation. This is why entire regions of the world can carry distinct spiritual climates. Some cities pulse with greed and pride, others are drenched in violence, despair, or oppression. It's not just cultural, it's spiritual. Behind the facades of governments and institutions, these thrones and dominions shape the worldview, morality, and spiritual openness of entire populations. They influence policy, inspire ideology, and inhabit power structures. They are not bound to temples or idols, as in ancient times. They now operate through systems, through media, through economics, through movements that appear organic but are spiritually engineered. The concept of portals, gateways between realms, further illustrates the complexity of Earth's spiritual architecture. These portals are not always dramatic supernatural rifts. Often, they are places where intense spiritual activity consistently occurs. In Scripture, we see Jacob encountering a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending, and he names the place Bethel, meaning house of God. That site had become a portal, a meeting place between dimensions. But just as there are holy portals, there are corrupted ones, sites defiled by blood, by ritual, by history. Ancient altars, battlegrounds, and areas of intense occult practice can serve as doorways for dark spiritual activity. These locations are spiritually charged, and without intentional cleansing or intercession, they remain points of entry for the enemy's forces. Sometimes entire cities or countries become strongholds because of the spiritual covenants made in their past. The land remembers. The atmosphere retains what was invoked upon it. Some of these strongholds are easy to recognize. Nations that repeatedly collapse into war, cultures saturated in fear or idolatry. Others are more sophisticated, places of wealth and influence that subtly spread spiritual decay through entertainment, education, or political influence. In these environments, deception thrives. Truth becomes relative. The sacred becomes mocked. And most people remain unaware that what they consider normal is, in fact, the product of invisible manipulation. These entities are not chaotic, they are highly organized. Daniel 10 offers a glimpse of this when the angel Gabriel tells Daniel that he was delayed for 21 days by the Prince of Persia, a spiritual ruler over a geographic empire. This prince was not a human monarch. It was a demonic principality. And when Gabriel spoke of returning to fight the Prince of Greece, he wasn't referring to Alexander the Great. He was naming the spiritual force that would rise after Persia fell. This tells us that history itself is shaped not only by human decision, but by battles in the heavens that often go unnoticed by those living on the ground. The war in heaven was never contained to one realm. It expanded. It seeded itself into the structures of this world, and it operates through deception, through hidden influence, and through generational patterns. It crafts ideologies that normalize what God forbids. It builds movements that carry noble facades but bear destructive spirits. It whispers into culture and embeds itself in legislation, education, and even theology when unguarded. But none of this is beyond discernment. While the enemy operates through secrecy, God provides revelation. Through His Word, through prayer, and through spiritual discernment, the Church is called to recognize these systems, not to fear them, but to confront them. The weapons of our warfare are not of this world, but they are powerful enough to tear down strongholds. Every believer walks through a world shaped by spiritual geography. Every city has unseen influences. Every nation has spiritual assignments, some holy, others unholy. Understanding this doesn't lead to paranoia, it leads to purpose. It awakens a deeper awareness that behind the political, cultural, and social unrest lies a supernatural conflict with ancient roots. For centuries, the war raged unchecked. Thrones of darkness remained in place, portals stayed open, principalities continued to influence cities, nations, and minds. Humanity, though chosen, remained entangled in cycles of rebellion and decay. Prophets came and went, altars were built and torn down, kings rose and fell, but the deep corruption seeded by the adversary had not been fully uprooted. Every move made by heaven up to this point had been to prepare for something greater. And then the moment arrived. Not with thunder from the sky or fire from the mountain, but with the cry of an infant in a manger. Jesus Christ did not enter the world through spectacle or splendor. He came through a virgin's womb, wrapped in humility and cloaked in obscurity. But his arrival was nothing short of a divine military operation. An infiltration of enemy-held territory with the intention of total reclamation. Heaven had launched a counterstrike, and the Son of God was the weapon. This was not merely a mission of moral teaching or symbolic sacrifice. It was a deliberate assault on the kingdom of darkness. 1 John 3 verse 8 declares, "The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil." That statement reframes the entire narrative of the gospel. Jesus came not just to heal or to preach, but to dismantle the infrastructure of rebellion, one act at a time. His every step was a confrontation. His very existence threatened the system Satan had spent ages building. From the moment of his birth, the war intensified. Herod's massacre of innocent children in Bethlehem was not just political paranoia, it was spiritual desperation. The dragon, having failed to stop the seed in Eden, now sought to eliminate him before he could grow. Revelation 12 captures this perfectly, portraying the dragon waiting to devour the child born of the woman. This was prophecy in motion, and Jesus was the fulfillment of everything Satan feared. As Jesus grew, his actions revealed a strategy far beyond earthly comprehension. He did not gather armies or call for revolution. Instead, he healed the sick, cast out demons, raised the dead, and declared the kingdom of God with authority. These miracles were not mere acts of compassion. They were direct assaults on the dominion of darkness. When he cast out demons, he wasn't performing isolated exorcisms. He was reclaiming territory. Every healing broke the grip of affliction that had no place in a restored creation. Every parable was a coded message, a spiritual declaration of the coming shift in power. His ministry was surgical, precise, tactical. Where Satan had corrupted identity, Jesus restored it. Where demons had taken residence, he evicted them. Where religion had become hollow and legalistic, he reignited it with truth and spirit. The spiritual war had come into the open, and Jesus walked the earth not as a victim, but as a king disguised in human flesh. Perhaps one of the clearest indications of the warfare Jesus engaged in was his repeated confrontation with unclean spirits. These beings, remnants of previous rebellions, did not challenge him. They feared him. They begged not to be cast out. They cried out in torment at his mere presence. The enemy knew who he was before most of humanity did. They could see the authority that radiated from him. To them, he was not just a man. He was the fulfillment of an ancient threat. The one who would crush the serpent's head had arrived. And with every word, every movement, the weight of judgment pressed closer. But the most brilliant aspect of heaven's plan was the cross. What appeared to be defeat was the ultimate ambush. Satan's systems were designed around power, fear, and force. In his blindness, he could not fathom that humility, obedience, and sacrifice could carry greater authority. He moved the hearts of men to arrest Jesus, to beat him, to crown him with thorns, and to crucify him. He believed he was eliminating the threat once and for all. But Jesus walked into death willingly, not as a victim of circumstances, but as a strategist fulfilling a divine mission. He said in John 10, verse 18, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." His death was not the enemy's victory. It was heaven's hidden blade. On the surface, the Son of God hung on a Roman cross. But in the unseen realm, gates were shaking, chains were snapping, and ancient curses were being shattered. Colossians 2 verse 15 reveals what happened behind the veil. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. The cross was not just a tool of execution, it was a battlefield. And Jesus, stripped and bloodied, was conquering every throne, every principality, every accusation that had ever been made against humanity. He took the full weight of sin, bore the curse, and absorbed the penalty, not to maintain peace, but to secure victory. When he died, the veil in the temple tore from top to bottom. Heaven's access was no longer restricted. The enemy had been played. The trap had been sprung. And 3 days later, the war took its most dramatic turn. The resurrection was not just a miracle, it was a declaration. Death had been the enemy's final weapon. If he could not corrupt or deceive, he could at least destroy. But now, even death had lost its grip. Jesus rose, not as a ghost, not as a spirit, but as a glorified man, the firstborn of a new creation. His resurrection was a signal flare in the spiritual realm that darkness had been broken. and the keys of death and Hades had been seized by the rightful king. In Revelation 1 verse 18, Jesus declares, "I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades." Those keys were not symbolic, they were reclaimed authority. Satan had overstepped. In crucifying the Son of God, he had opened the very path to his own defeat. The gospel, then, is not only about reconciliation, it is about overthrow. It is not merely the good news of forgiveness, it is the announcement of a kingdom, one that is advancing, one that cannot be stopped. And Jesus, far from being just a moral teacher, is the commander of heaven's armies, the Word made flesh, the warrior who came behind enemy lines and broke the siege from within. For a people who were born into battle, many within the church now live as though there is no conflict at all. The war that began in heaven, the rebellion that spread to earth, the cosmic struggle that touched Eden, bled through history and culminated at the cross. This war has not ended. Yet in sanctuaries and congregations across the globe, the urgency of this war has been replaced with rituals, entertainment, and comfort. The sword has been laid down and the armor has been traded for applause. The early followers of Christ knew that faith in him was not merely an invitation to eternal life, it was a call to arms. The moment Jesus ascended and commissioned his disciples, the church was born in the fires of spiritual resistance. Their message pierced through paganism, idolatry, and demonic systems that had ruled for generations. They understood the cost. They expected resistance. They spoke of spiritual weapons, angelic encounters, warfare in prayer, and standing against the schemes of the enemy. But over time, something changed. The battlefield became a stage. The gathering of warriors was transformed into an audience. The messages once filled with clarity about spiritual conflict became sanitized, dulled, and often hollowed of any sense of the supernatural. The devil, once rightly feared and opposed, became a caricature, reduced to a metaphor for bad decisions, ignored as a myth, or worse, disguised behind intellectual respectability. In many churches today, spiritual warfare is rarely addressed. If it is mentioned, it's diluted, presented as emotional struggle or general hardship. But the truth is far more urgent. There are demonic assignments against families. Territorial spirits still operate over cities. Generational curses go unchecked. Doors remain open through unrepented sin, occult influence, and passive Christianity. And all the while, many believers sit unaware that they are surrounded by enemies who do not sleep, do not relent, and do not forget. Paul's warning in Ephesians 6 verse 11 was not poetic flourish. He wrote, "Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes." He assumed resistance. He expected that believers would be attacked. He outlined armor, not for display, but for survival. Truth, righteousness, readiness, faith, salvation, the Word of God, these were not symbolic accessories. They were necessities for a church that understood its position on the front lines. But the modern church, in many places, has forgotten its position. Instead of preparing warriors, it builds audiences. Instead of training in righteousness, it entertains with empty inspiration. Instead of confronting darkness, it seeks peace with the culture. In doing so, it has become numb to the real battle and vulnerable to subtle infiltration. The result is a sleeping army, still numerous, still powerful in potential, but unaware of its mission. This amnesia is not accidental, it is strategic. The enemy has no interest in destroying a church that does not threaten his kingdom. He fears not the gatherings that never speak of holiness, never teach discernment, never call for spiritual authority. He fears a church that knows who it is, a church that wakes up, a church that remembers. When believers cease to fight, they become prisoners of war without even knowing it. They carry wounds, but have no idea where they came from. They face oppression, but cannot name its source. They accept torment as normal because they've never been taught that they have authority to break it. And the spiritual leaders who once were meant to act as generals have too often been trained to be performers. This doesn't mean every church has fallen into this pattern, but it highlights a widespread condition, a spiritual lethargy that is incompatible with the reality of the war we are in. The New Testament church cast out demons, healed the sick, discerned spirits, and confronted power. They were hated by the world because they confronted the forces behind it. Their boldness was not reckless, it was necessary. They understood that to follow Christ was to declare allegiance in a war that demanded vigilance. What does it mean for a believer to awaken? It begins with recognizing that passivity is not neutral, it is dangerous. The moment you were born again, you were enlisted. Whether you want to fight or not, the enemy sees you as a threat. Ignoring that fact does not protect you, it simply makes you easier to manipulate. To awaken is to rediscover your armor and put it on, not in fear, but in faith. It is to realize that every prayer carries authority, that worship shifts atmospheres, that the word is not just inspirational, it is a sword forged in heaven. It is to know that your life matters in a war that stretches beyond time, and that you were born to carry light into places where others still walk in darkness. The call to wake up is not an insult, it is a call back to identity. The church was never meant to blend in. It was never meant to bow to culture, to dilute truth, or to retreat into private belief. It was born in fire, called to stand in conflict, and destined to overcome. We are not spectators in this war. We are soldiers, trained, equipped, and empowered by the one who already won the decisive battle. But that victory must be enforced. The enemy remains active, not because Christ failed, but because many of his people have forgotten to stand. This is the uncomfortable truth. The church must remember that it was born into war. And now more than ever it must rise and fight, not with hate, but with holy fire. Not with violence, but with vigilance. The world does not need a passive church, it needs a prophetic one. A church that prays, that discerns, that moves in power and does not apologize for its authority. There are no accidents in the divine order. The time and place of your birth, the circumstances you emerged from, the battles you faced, the questions that haunt you, they are not coincidences. They are coordinates, indicators that you were placed in this moment, in this generation, with purpose. You were born into a war, not because of what you've done, but because of what you carry. From the beginning, the enemy has sought to silence the image of God in the earth. He's targeted bloodlines, cultures, cities, and nations, but perhaps his fiercest attacks have been reserved for individuals, those who, knowingly or not, hold keys to breakthrough. You may have felt the pressure, the resistance, the weight of battles that seem beyond explanation. That's not a sign of weakness. It's a mark of significance. Darkness does not waste its ammunition. If you've been targeted, it's because you matter. You are not here to merely survive. You were never meant to float through life, avoiding risk and avoiding impact. The very breath in your lungs is a testimony that heaven has not given up on this world, and you are part of that story. This is not flattery. This is a truth forged in the fires of eternity. Before you ever cried your first cry, a war was already being waged. And whether you recognized it or not, you were born on a battlefield. But you were not born without weapons. You were given authority, not the kind that comes from titles or applause, but the kind that flows from the one who crushed the serpent's head. When you said yes to Christ, you weren't simply forgiven. You were recruited, enlisted into a kingdom that advances through love and righteousness, but also through power and confrontation. And that kingdom does not move through silence. It moves through voices raised, armor worn, and truth declared without compromise. Ephesians 6 lays it out plainly. You are to put on the full armor of God. Not partial, not occasionally, but fully and daily. The belt of truth, holding everything in place. The breastplate of righteousness, guarding your heart from the enemy's accusations. feet fitted with readiness, because you carry a message that changes everything, the shield of faith, quenching every flaming arrow aimed at your mind, your identity, your calling. The helmet of salvation, protecting your thoughts with the unshakable reality that you belong to God. And the sword of the Spirit, the Word, not just for reading, but for warfare. In theory, this is survival. Too many have fallen because they thought the battle was someone else's to fight. Too many live in defeat, not because they lack power, but because they've never been taught to use it. The time for spiritual passivity is over. You've been entrusted with more than a seat in a church. You've been handed a weapon. The enemy's worst fear is not a louder church, it's an awakened one. You carry something dangerous to the kingdom of darkness, light. Not a light you manufactured, but one placed in you by the Creator himself. That light exposes lies, it breaks curses, it shifts atmospheres, it speaks into silence and sets captives free, it confronts what others tolerate, it creates where others fear. And when you walk in that light, the enemy cannot stand in your path without being exposed. You are not fighting for victory, you are fighting from it. Jesus already broke the spine of Satan's authority. The war was won at the cross. But the occupation remains, and it is your job, our job, to enforce the victory in every place the enemy still claims as his own. That includes your home, your community, your calling, your generation. The hidden war is not hidden anymore. Now that you see it, now that you feel its weight, the next move is yours. You don't need to wait for a sign. You are the sign. You don't need another word. You are living proof that God still breathes purpose into dust and still raises up soldiers from broken places. You don't need perfect qualifications. You need availability, willingness, a heart that says yes even when fear whispers no. Understand this, the enemy knows who you are, even if you don't. He sees your potential. He sees the chains you were born to break, the strongholds you were meant to tear down, the legacy you were meant to rewrite. And he's terrified. That's why he attacks. That's why he lies. That's why he distracts, numbs, and seduces. Because if you ever truly step into your authority, his dominion in your territory ends. This is the call to arms, a call to physical violence, but to spiritual vigilance. A call to discernment in a world drunk on confusion. A call to boldness in a culture that worships silence. A call to purity in a time of compromise. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You just need to be awake, aware, armed with truth, grounded in love, and unwilling to let the enemy win by default. God has never needed crowds. He needs catalysts, individuals who carry the fire, who understand that their prayers shake unseen structures, that their obedience changes bloodlines, that their worship is not filler between sermons, but warfare that cracks the sky open, that their surrender is not weakness, but strength wrapped in trust. You were not random, you were not late, you were not overlooked, you were born for this. Every scar, every tear, every battle you've survived has prepared you for this moment. You are not the sum of your mistakes, you are the carrier of a call. And now that you've seen the truth of this hidden war, there is no going back to spiritual sleep. The battle is around you, the battle is in you, and the one who called you has already equipped you. Now it's time to rise, time to speak, time to fight. Not with fear, but with fire. Not with panic, but with promise. If this message stirred something inside you, if it opened your eyes, challenged your thinking, or helped you realize that you were born for a greater purpose, then don't keep it to yourself. Share this truth, speak it, let others see what you now know. Make sure to subscribe to this channel so you never miss another teaching that peels back the veil and reveals the reality behind the headlines and the ordinary. There is more to come, and you won't want to miss what heaven still has to reveal. Like this video, if it impacted you, it helps others find it, and it signals to the platform that these messages matter. Comment below Tell us what stood out to you, what you're taking with you, or even what you're still wrestling with. Your story could be the encouragement someone else desperately needs. And most of all, share this video with your friends, your family, your community. We are not just here to consume truth, we're here to spread it. This message wasn't meant to stay hidden, and now that you've seen it, the mission continues through you. Thank you for watching. Now go. Take up your armor, step into your authority, and never forget, you were born for this battle.